Hello and good evening, I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kutub.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now tonight on the show we're going to be taking a closer look at the true scale of youth unemployment in Malaysia. Has the true extent of the economic vulnerabilities faced by young Malaysians been adequately understood and addressed by policymakers? So later in the show, we're going to be speaking to policy analysts about the available options to address the severity of the problem. But first, we begin with news of a DBKL notice banning refugees from entering the Kuala Lumpur wholesale market. Now, the DBKL notice also stated that foreigners with valid papers must be accompanied by a Malaysian to enter the market. So I don't think any reason was given for the ban that was stated in the notice, but it does come after the DBKL announcing last month that license holders at wholesale, public and private markets are only allowed to hire locals that have been approved by the KL Mayor. Now, Sharad, I found this news a little ironic, given that it came to light on World Refugee Day, a day to raise awareness about the plight of refugees around the world. And here we are in Malaysia, not allowing them to simply enter a market.
Well, you know, Melissa, I mean, just to give the DBKL the benefit of the doubt, I guess that they are implementing what is policy at this point in time, which doesn't allow refugees to work.
Sure.
And, you know, and because the refugees have been found working illegally in some of these markets, I guess that this attempt to manage that problem is what this notice is about. But it goes back, I think, Melissa, to the many suggestions made over the many years about how we should deal with and treat humanely and with some, I think, a level of pragmatism,
right,
the question of refugees among us, right? So there have been suggestions that, in fact, by making them, making work something that they can do legally, it's actually good for the economy.
Yes.
Add, you know, I think Ideas has come out with some rough calculations about some 3 billion being added to the economy. And of course, when you have to work, and you do it with the full protection of the law, then you're less vulnerable to
exploitation
and you know, extortion,
yes,
from those in authority who can now use your vulnerability to enrich themselves.
Well, I have some numbers from Ideas that you cited a bit earlier. You're absolutely right. 3 billion ringgit added to the Malaysian economy through higher spending if refugees are given the right to work. An increase in tax revenues, total contribution of 50 million ringgit each year by 2024. And in fact, locals will benefit too. Refugees in the economic system will help create some 4,000 jobs for Malaysians. So, so those are some of the kind of quantitative backing information that we have coming up from Ideas on why we should give refugees the right to work. You
know, Melissa, I think sometimes in the public debate about refugees or migrants, there's a kind of zero-sum mentality, right? So that we say, okay, 160,000 refugees having the right to work will somehow diminish the ability of locals to find jobs, right, and so on and so forth. I mean, that is the way it's framed, and I don't know if that's in fact the truth. And because refugees, unlike you know, migrants who come here specifically for work, because they've been pushed out of their country because of warfare and so on and so forth, might actually be very skilled individuals. And the question is, why don't we have a policy that tries to identify the skills among the refugee population and, you know, leverage on that so that it's in fact a win-win for both Malaysians, the Malaysian economy, and the individual refugees.
Yeah, perhaps time to relook some of our policies surrounding refugees here in Malaysia. But in other news, we have the Centre for Orang Asli Concerns. They've highlighted that loggers have resumed logging activities in at least 2 areas populated by the Orang Asli. Now, this includes the same site where the Tamias had set up a blockade a year ago. The then Pakatan Menteri Besar, now Perikatan Menteri Besar, had halted the logging only temporarily, but that logging halt had also continued under the MCO. But now we have the Centre for Orang Asli Concerns warning also that the resumption of logging activities could affect other Orang Asli communities, particularly in Kelantan.
So we return to these questions, it seems, you know, on a regular basis, Melissa. The Orang Asli community, the environment and the ecosystems in which they live, not just for their livelihood, but because of the cultural values, the religious values that those ecosystems give to them, under threat by developers in collusion with politicians at the level of the state. Right. You know, and so the question, this tussle always comes up. Now, the question is, why is this the case? Is it because, at least at the state level, you know, land is a resource from which the state can get some revenues and they are loath to give that up? And also, those resources are seen as, what do you think, Melissa? I mean,
money-making machines.
Absolutely. So they're seen essentially, right? In terms of their, in a very crude sense, their economic worth, right? Not their long-term economic worth, but their short-term economic worth. You log a forest, you get those logs out, some money goes to the state. I think
that's completely a valid point to make. You know, the way we treat the environment, I think, could tie into how Orang Asli communities are marginalized within Malaysia. You know, these are natural ecosystems that they use to depend on their livelihoods. It's more than just making money. It is a way of life. And I think just looking at it through the prism of economic utility has caused for us to marginalize these communities.
Interestingly enough, during the Pakatan Harapan time, the intervention of the Minister of National Unity and also the Attorney General's chambers sort of were trying to negotiate a solution. I think the law is around native customary land still being fought out in our court system. It's interesting to see whether any political formation in this country, Pakatan Harapan, you know, Perikatan Nasional, Pakatan Harapan 2.0, whatever it is might come in the future or not come in the future, will be able to form a policy that in the interest of everybody, including the Orang Asli communities.
All right, well, if this logging activity continues, we're going to keep a close eye on this story as it develops. But for now, in just a few minutes, we're going to be speaking to policy analysts about their read on the true scale of youth unemployment. Stay tuned to consider this.
Coronavirus yang seolah-olah masih tiada
vaksin.
Silakan ke epicenter.
Kalau boleh,
kes ni dapat di quarantine di hospital ataupun di rumah.
So there you are, and in Singapore, so far away it seems these days.
Tidak boleh dipisahkan, tidak boleh dipisahkan.
But you know, we're all connected online nowadays.
Working from home. Very good. So thank you again for doing this. We will, I think, want to get to the question of, you know, how do we move this conversation on youth unemployment forward?
And what kind of new things came to light as you were researching this?
Masa, cerita pasal kesenian, cerita pasal hiburan, cerita pasal kecerdasan, cerita pasal sukan, cerita pasal travel, cerita pasal sejarah, fakta-fakta menarik. Dan mereka juga ada buat short film dan juga dokumentari. Dan yang paling penting, Rancak TV tak ada cerita pasal politik.
Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. With me is Sharad Kutun. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the unemployment rate lately, especially after the Department of Statistics revealed that Malaysia's unemployment rate for April at 5% was the highest it's been in 30 years. But what do we understand about the realities of youth unemployment? Will young Malaysians disproportionately bear the brunt of the economic fallout from the pandemic? Joining us on the show now to discuss this further, we have Lee Hock An, Senior Fellow at the SCS Yusof Ishak Institute. Hock An, thank you so much for joining us on the show this evening. Now, Malaysia's been dealing with the issue of youth unemployment since even before the pandemic. Much has been said about the structural underpinnings of this issue. But you have recently come up with a paper on some current concerns about youth unemployment. Hock An, what has your research revealed that perhaps has not been highlighted before in kind of previous discussions about this issue?
Hi, good evening, Sharad and Melissa. Thanks for having me here. It's good to join you on this topic. So this paper that I wrote, it's a short paper that's exploring some broad trends and identifying areas of concern. I think as you had described it, so it's more of exploration and identifying what needs further research or policy focus. So it's not really an in-depth research on the causes of unemployment, but a survey of many aspects. And in the course of it, I was trying to pull insights primarily from the labor force survey report. So it is a report that is describing it's summarizing some of the categories of employment and unemployment from the labor force survey. And so it's also quite general. But there were a few, that I think stood out. And I was, going through categories like region, gender, and ethnicity. So one of those that stood out was for Sabah, the unemployment. Firstly, the first stage of participation is called labor force participation. That involves that refers to who is choosing to seek work, and from there you then you are in the labor force, and then after which you are either working and employed or unemployed. So the unemployed are those who are in the labor force and looking for work but not able to find work. I just wanted to clarify that because when we talk about youth labor force participation, it is referring to that specifically, not those who are going to university or who are not looking for work. And so one thing that stood out in Sabah was for the category of late teens, 15 to 19 years old. Their labor force participation rate is remarkably high. It's almost double the rest of the country at about 40%, whereas it's about 20% for the rest of the country. So now this is, there are many aspects to this. I mean, it's not, so clear-cut positive or negative, but I think if it is suggesting that youth are leaving secondary school, and I think here we also look further at whether it's full-time or part-time employment, and the evidence suggests that it is full-time employment. So I think that's rather young to be doing that, and rather than secondary school or post-secondary school.
Hogan, if I can just jump in there. Sorry, Hogan, if I can just jump in there. The excerpts that we've had on the show talking about the impact of the lockdown on school-going children is that the expectation is that we'll have many more people dropping out, many more young people. And presumably they're dropping out to support their families, get into the labor market. Perhaps it's too early to tell, but is that what's happening in Sabah? Is there something about the impact of this crisis or just the nature of Sabah's economy that pushes young people out into the workforce much earlier than the national average?
I'm glad you brought that up. The data I was referring to was for 2019. This survey is happening continuously, and so what we receive on the monthly report, I think the sample size is not large enough that we can zoom in on the youth specifically. But I think based on that, and we had seen the trends year to year, and the latest for 2019 for us to look at youth unemployment shows that some of these trends are rising. As in, some youth unemployment in particular categories is rising. I think another one is when we break it up ethnically for Indian youth, they register a higher unemployment rate. So I think it's not conclusive yet what the statistics for that might show the effects of COVID-19 and the MCO. But these are longer-term trends that suggest, I think, that particular groups are likely to be impacted more because they already have a higher unemployment rate.
However, you mentioned that there's high levels of unemployment among young Indians, looking at the ethnic dimension. Is this mirrored in adult Indians in the labor force? Do you see a relationship there?
Yeah, I was focused on a few. So let me clarify with some of the conventions that we follow, which are international, whereby the labor force is aged between 15 and 64, and the data that we have mostly breaks it down in 5-year brackets. So 15 to 19, 20 to 24, 25 to 29, and I was looking mainly at 15 to 24, but also 25 to 29 for with Indian unemployment within Indian population. It is higher than the other groups in those 3 categories. But beyond that, beyond the 30s, there's very little difference, at least in those statistics. So it does pinpoint that, yeah, it's very much focused on youth.
Okay.
And in any case, overall, the numbers of unemployed, about 60% are within 15 and 24.
And within the categories of unemployment that you were looking at, within youth unemployment, did you look at the gender dimension? Are young women increasingly unemployed?
The young women overall, yes, they record a higher unemployment rate. There, I found that there were some interesting variations by region. So Sabah actually is for men and women, where unemployment is relatively high. But also in some other, we can go state by state for female graduates. It's higher in Terengganu, Perlis, and Kelantan, some of the east coast and the northern states. Actually, it's relatively high even in the central, Selangor, KL. So I think there's a lot more that can be broken down. It's still dealing with some generalities, but I think again it's giving us some clues.
Yeah.
With some states relatively more affected, and as well the possible role of the economic structure of norms, and
right.
expectations and that sort of thing that are gender defined. I mean, these are large realms of research, and there are many experts, I think, who can comment,
Sure.
with a lot more.
I'm sure there's lots more to research into in this matter. And we want to thank you, Hock An, for speaking to us tonight and kind of giving us a breakdown of the categories of youth unemployment that you were looking at. We're going to take a quick break, but more on this issue in just a few minutes. So stay tuned to Consider This.
A minute and a half before we actually answer the question.
Saya. Hi, Juwita. Thank you so much for doing this with us tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.
Yeah, we see you
good
clearly.
Topic.
Yes, great.
Great.
Can you hear us clearly?
Yes.
Okay.
Loud and clear.
Perfect.
I
How
think
many minutes do we have, guys?
really not going to be enough time. It's a very, big topic, but we'll just try and alert our listeners to some key issues so they leave the show thinking about them more deeply and perhaps frame differently.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure, okay.
Hi, thank you for staying with Sharad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation about youth unemployment in Malaysia and whether the true extent of the economic vulnerabilities faced by young Malaysians has been adequately understood and addressed. Joining us now, we have Juwita Muhammad, Fellow with the Economics, Trade and Regional Integration Division of the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, or better known as ISIS Malaysia. Thank you so much, Juwita, for joining us this evening. Now, are there blind spots in the way policymakers understand economic vulnerabilities faced by young Malaysians?
Well, in my opinion, there needs to be a deep reform in our education system. The unemployment issue among the youth will not be solved by just having more job availability. The right jobs is the issue. So for the last few years, we saw that semi-skilled and also low-skilled jobs were more available as compared to skilled jobs in Malaysia. And this has led to underemployment among our youth, our workers as a whole, and especially the Bumi Putra and the Bumi Putra group. The quality of our graduates and also the skills that they are equipped with upon their graduation, may be from university, from colleges, and even from vocational centers, is vital. So that, again, they're more employable to our industries, which should be shifting into a more automation, a more digitalized form in the near future. So a survey conducted by the World Bank and also Talent Corps a few years ago highlighted a very worrying situation where 90% of the firms surveyed thought that job seekers needed more industrial training in Malaysia, and around 80% reported that there is a lack of communication skills among graduates. And what is a bigger challenge is that 80% of the respondents said that university programs are not reflective of the current job market on the ground with what is needed by the industries. So yes, it is a big issue.
Right, Juwita, it seems like this is a long-standing conversation we've had nationally about, especially graduate unemployment, much higher than the national average and so on and so forth. But yet, we didn't seem, or the governments of the day didn't seem to be able to remedy the situation or change the institutional priorities at public universities, never mind the private universities. Why do you think we haven't actually been able to grab the bull by the horns when it comes to unemployment, especially graduate unemployment?
Well, again, the problem is not just with the unemployment, it goes back to our education system. And I feel that a total reform of the education is very much needed, but also it will take a lot of parties to work together, and I think that is the #1 challenge in this country. Just to highlight to you how big of a problem it is for our TVET program alone, there are 7 different ministries that are in charge of myriads of programs, of TVET programs at different levels of education. It could be degree programs, also it could be for diploma and certificate. So we have been in talks with different policymakers, and there needs to be a streamline of some sort for these programs to be more efficient and more effective in delivering quality programs in the future.
Well, Juwita, it seems that this problem has been, one that's been talked about even before the pandemic. I think most researchers agree that the structural underpinnings like education, skills mismatch, all that seem to be the underlying issues. But what is ISIS's sense of the scale of youth unemployment given the current pandemic? Have youth been disproportionately impacted by the economic fallout of this pandemic?
So in January 2020, our team published an article on youth employment in Malaysia and also in the region. In 2018, we found that the youth unemployment rate in Malaysia is at 10.9%, which is lower than the regional, with our regional peers in the Asia and also in the Pacific. But when we delve deeper, we found that in ASEAN, we have the 3rd highest unemployment rate for youth. So this is after Indonesia, and this is after the Philippines. And again, for an upper middle income country, priority should be given to solve this issue, especially if we want to graduate and become a high income status country and to become a highly industrialized country in the near future. But again, let me just highlight to you like some of the latest data on unemployment. There are now 610,000 people who are unemployed, and this is a very significant increase from around 500,000 from the year before in March. So our workforce now is around 15.23 million, and from that, around 3 million are those who are account workers, who do freelancing, who have their own businesses. So as it stands now, graduate unemployment alone usually would be around 300,000 to 350,000 like every year. So this is normal. But then due to the pandemic, it has stood at around 30%, which is very worrying. And these are again data for those with tertiary education. When we look at teenage job seekers in our paper, we found that there are about 1.7 times more likely to lose their jobs than young adults of 20 to 24-year-olds. And then these teenage job seekers are almost 5 times more likely to be unemployed than the labor force population. So this is an observation made well before the pandemic.
Okay, so Juwita, I do want to ask you about the preference or ideological orientation of policymakers. Are they looking for market-driven solutions? Are they thinking that the state should be the one jumping in and intervening? What's your sense of it? And does the COVID and the recession that's coming change that that conversation significantly?
A couple of years ago, the last government had set up a special TVET committee made up of different stakeholders, different players from the government to the industries. But those findings and those propositions were not made public. So since then, we haven't seen much when it comes to TVET reforms, for example. But again, it needs to be changed now. If there wasn't an urgency before, there is an urgency now, and it's not a problem that will solve itself in 2-3 years. It needs a long time. It's a long-term planning.
Well, yeah. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight and highlighting the urgency of looking at this now so that we have a long-term solution, Juwita. We appreciate your time and your insights on the show tonight. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kutan signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night.